I don't think it's controversial to say that video game graphics look better now than they did like 30 years ago, right? Like, when we get past the nostalgia and weird core Silent Hill 2 edits, there's definitely been an upward trend in quality. But how do we know that? How did that happen, and what does that really mean?
Fucking computers and shit have gotten better, so now we can have more polygons and higher resolution textures.
Yes, that's true, but it's not the whole story. For one, more polygons and higher res textures don't always lead to better visuals. And secondly, animation predates video games and 3D graphics for at least a century. So how are techniques still getting better today? And what is better? How can we tell? First of all, stylized graphics can look great, but for the purpose of quantifying better here, I'm going to be talking mainly about graphical realism. Even still, most stylized graphics still rely on a lot of the techniques that I'll be talking about here. So as I said, animation, depending on how you define it, predates video games by either like 50 years or like most of human history. Walt Disney lived his entire life in a world where video games didn't exist. And he also lived in a world where rich people could kind of do whatever they want, like create self-governing states within already existing internationally recognized territories by manipulating the working class and giving shitloads of money to people in power. So I guess maybe the world hasn't changed that much in the past 100 years. But animation has. The most noticeable change obviously has been the invention of 3D animation. When or how 3D animation was invented is kind of weird to talk about, because the goal of a lot of 2D animation is to make something that's 2D appear as though it's moving in 3D space. The difference is pretty obvious to us nowadays, and even then there was a distinct separation between 2D and 3D, but there were also definitely a lot of gray areas. For example, take these two games, Sonic Blast and Sonic 3D Blast. Based on the titles, which one of them do you think utilized real-time 3D rendering? That's right, neither of them. The important word here is real-time, which means that the 3D rendering is done on the hardware while the game is being played. These games both use pre-rendered 3D models, which is more like if you made the 3D model on a separate computer beforehand that could actually do that, and then took a picture of it from all the angles you need to see it from, and then put those pictures into the game. This is a lot more computationally efficient than real-time 3D rendering for fairly obvious reasons. This was relatively common back then and is still used sometimes today when performance is a high priority, like in Hades. This is all a very long-winded way of saying that that guy was kind of right. Computers today are just a lot better, and even low-end machines can push hundreds of thousands of polygons per frame, not taking into account other graphical processes like lighting and shaders and post-processing. Okay, lighting, shaders, and post-processing. Why did that just make this video way more complicated? They're all kind of big umbrella terms, and a lot goes into each of them, so it's best to just show you. As I said, triangle count or polygon count isn't much of a problem and hasn't really been for most of the past 20 years. Let's look at Silent Hill 3. This is Heather. Heather looks like a person. She looks like a real human person. The shape of her face geometrically looks pretty much indistinguishable from reality. The texture of her skin, the dryness of her lips, her irises, they're maybe a little low resolution, but for 2003, this is pretty good. So why is it that when we see Ellie from The Last of Us 2 in 2020, she, for one, looks way more realistic than Heather, but we can also still pretty easily tell that she's a 3D model and not an actual person. Okay, obviously, to get it out of the way, there's more polygons and higher resolution textures, yes. We can see this really well in her Philtrum, for example. Because of the higher resolution mesh, there's just light going in there that Heather could not possibly have dreamed of. This is mainly useful in close-up shots like this, and this is also not her real-time gameplay model. This is a cutscene model, which means that this is most likely a pre-rendered cutscene, which means it's pretty much doing the same thing Sonic Blast was like 30 years ago. So aside from that, we can see that the environmental lighting is much more accurate to real life. There's actual specular highlights. The depth of values is larger. Lighting has a lot of really complicated techniques that I actually don't know very much about, and it's a lot harder to identify specific techniques because individually they're all pretty subtle. And it's also just a much more esoteric topic in terms of technical work. For artistic work though, it pretty much exactly mirrors lighting in real life film and photography. This screenshot is a pretty good example of 3-point lighting, which Silent Hill 3 has sometimes, mostly in promotional artwork, but in-game and even in cutscenes, it's pretty clear that the lighting technology just wasn't really there yet. So in this case, the artistic techniques for good lighting have been known for long before 3D rendering even existed, but until about the past decade or two, we just lacked the computing power and techniques to make good tools for widespread use. In terms of shaders and post-processing, the biggest thing is probably her hair. 3D rendering hair has always been extremely difficult. We can see that Heather's hair at her roots looks kind of okay, but as it gets down to the ends where it should be getting thinner, it just kind of doesn't. Ellie doesn't have this problem. We can really distinctly see each individual strand of hair, yet as a whole it creates a convincing form, which is interesting when compared to earlier approaches that mimic sort of a more traditional approach of drawing hair in 2D, where you more so visualize it as a mass or volume of texture rather than trying to draw every individual strand strand of hair. Hair rendering still isn't perfect, but in a pre-rendered cutscene like this, it's pretty close to reality. If we look at a real-time gameplay model though, we can see that while it is still pretty good, the lighting is a bit weird at shallow angles, and the hair does still clump up into some distinct textured flat shapes like with Heather. So, you know, it's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. Like lighting, hair rendering is very complicated. There's a lot of different techniques which I don't know about because I'm not a graphics programmer, and hair is one of those things where if you want to learn about it, you have to actually like read real academic papers about it, which like, I'm not gonna do that. I just said I'm not a graphics programmer. I don't have to do that. That's not my job. Another technique that helps sell the realism here while still being really subtle is on her ears. Everyone knows that when you shine light through thin parts of your body, like your ears or your fingers, it comes through a little bit red on the other side. You can't really see Heather's ears at all, but trust me, she doesn't have this. This is a technique called subsurface scattering, and we can actually also see it in parts of her hair in that cutscene model because it's pretty much the same thing, just light passing through that really thin part of solid, like hair and ear cartilage. Again, no idea how this one actually works, I just know that it exists and it's pretty common in most AAA games at this point. In case it isn't obvious, we're very quickly reaching the limit of my technical knowledge here. In my defense, I don't have a formal education in computer science. Pretty much everything I know about game development, everything I'm talking about here and in all of my other videos, is stuff that I've learned pretty anecdotally on my own, mostly self-taught over the past like 3.5 years, which I think is pretty good. I may not be a graphics programmer and I may not know exactly the complicated math and algorithms behind most of this stuff, but I know that they exist and I can identify them to determine the graphical quality of a work of 3D art, which I think is the important part, but if you think I'm a fraud for that, then sure, that's fine, whatever. Anyways, another big revolution that came about in the past decade is called the physically based rendering pipeline, or PBR pipeline. The goal of PBR is to basically make materials for 3D objects that can pretty accurately simulate how light interacts with various different surfaces in real life. The big three when it comes to this pipeline are normal maps, roughness maps, and height or displacement maps. There's also other ones like metallic and ambient occlusion and emission, but they're generally not as important. As with before, these are all a little hard to describe with words, so it's best to just show you. This is a random brick material I downloaded off the internet, and it came with the big three. So first, this is what the texture looks like with just the base color map. Like before, we can absolutely tell that this is bricks. This is what real life bricks look like because the artist who made this knew how to draw bricks. But if we add just the normal map, we can see that it already gives the material much more depth, and there's shadows in there that just weren't there before. So how does that work? Well, the normal in normal maps refers to face normals, which is basically just the direction that every face of a 3D mesh is pointing in. Knowing this is useful for a lot of things, not just in graphics, but here, the normal map is basically just adding a boatload of detail so that rather than every face having a normal vector, every pixel of the texture has one. And this gives us a lot more depth and finer detail, especially with shadows, with much less computational power because instead of adding a couple extra thousand polygons, we're just adding a couple extra thousand normal vectors. The next two are a lot simpler. Roughness is just how rough or smooth the material is at every pixel on the texture. This brick is actually a terrible example because it's pretty much completely rough across the whole thing, but on materials like plastic, we can really see how much of a difference this makes. It's also really useful for making things look wet. Displacement is used very similarly to normals, but as the name implies, it actually displaces the mesh, which is really good for if you're looking at something like a brick wall from a shallow angle. Ambient occlusion is the occlusion of ambient light, basically just gently blocking light from entering wherever it's used. This is mostly useful for making really soft shadows in tight spaces. I did mention a bit ago that it's part of the PBR pipeline, but it can also be used as a screen space post-processing effect, which I'll explain in a second. As a PBR texture, this can be used to do things like add details to characters' faces and bodies. For example, under the characters' eyes, inside their ears, and their mouths and their nostrils. It just gives that little bit of extra shadow that you would see in real life that might not necessarily be happening in the 3D model because of ambient environmental light. As a post-processing effect, this is mostly useful for games environments, since if you have textures that tile, there could be parts of the geometry that should be darkened, but no guaranteed spot on the texture to do that with. Especially like corners of a room. The room I'm in, right there, I can see it. Like the little extra bit of shadow right in the line, right in the corner of the room. There's some extra shadow right there. That's ambient occlusion right there. So the screen space effect basically just detects areas of meshes that are tight like corners and applies ambient occlusion to them at runtime. This has been a lot of information, and it's pretty much all the most noticeable ways graphics have improved since like the 2000s, but to be honest, we're still just scratching the surface of all this. I haven't even mentioned more specific graphical challenges like fog and water, and like I said before, there's a lot of stuff that I don't even really know about. If you want to learn more, there's plenty of resources on the internet about this stuff, but I'd say that the best best way of learning about this stuff is to just do it yourself. Open a game engine and start playing with the settings and see what you like. Go find some random 3D models and textures online and just set up a scene and mess with the lighting. So I guess as a short answer to the question in the title, it's a combination of better computational power granting greater freedoms for artists to create what they envision, as well as new tools being created by artists who are also very smart, which allows less smart artists like me to also make cool looking things. And one more thing before I end this video, in case you're new here or haven't noticed yet, this is me. I haven't done this before. This is my face and body reveal. I'll probably be doing this more from now on, just to make the videos more engaging, so it's not just random footage of whatever game I'm talking about. So let me know in the comments if you like this, and I'll see you in the next one. I think I've been doing this like the entire video. Awkward as hell, but whatever. I did mention a bit ago that it's part of the PBR type. Fuck. Basically just gently blocking white. Hold on, I'm recording for it. Too fucking long. I really have just been doing this the entire video. Oh my god, that's awful. So let me know in the comments if you like. Don't do that. Let me know in the comments if you like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Don't fucking do that.